John Hotson hails from Minneapolis, Minnesota. He received his BA in the economics department from the Colorado College, I think it was. Is that correct, John? And he went on to the University of Pennsylvania, where he received his PhD. This man is a highly qualified economist. He is competent to do battle with the best in New Zealand and beat them. And it's interesting to me that none of them have wanted to front up to him on the New Zealand television and take him head on, because he'd have some embarrassing things, I think, to confront them with. Ladies and gentlemen, I rang him a few months ago and asked if he'd like to come to New Zealand. He said he'd love to come. He said, how long for? I said, I took a deep breath and said, how about a month? He said, oh my goodness, a month's a long time. It would have to be in my summer holidays. I said, that's great. I didn't tell him it was our winter. And he had a wonderful few moments talking to him. I was very excited to come off the phone. He remembered that New Zealand had been a place of economic experiment. He commented something I thought that I'd had for many years, that New Zealand was a small enough Western economy and democratic enough, some of us would question that, but democratic enough to really create some change and maybe show the entire world a model of how things might be. I thought there was exciting stuff on the phone. Sir, it's wonderful that you're here. I'm sorry I haven't been here to enjoy it. My colleagues have been full of it, and now the delegates are going to hear from you. I hope I haven't taken too much of your words, but it's the only chance I'm going to get. So thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Gary. President Wright, I got that wrong, didn't I? President Leach, Leader Wright, Kea ora, Kiwis. Fellow monetary reformers, fellow Democrats, and guests. It has been a great pleasure to my wife Jennifer and I to spend the month of August traveling through your beautiful North and South Islands to many cities, spreading the doctrine of monetary reform. I've been telling New Zealanders that you led once in the 1930s. You did very much the same things that I'm urging to the sovereignty proposals that you do now. You used the government's sovereign powers over money to create very low interest loans directly for housing, for public works, for your export industries, and then use needed import controls to limit your imports to what you could finance in a depressed world by your exports. And I urged people, I urge you, I urge everybody who will listen to pioneer again that New Zealand led the world once. You were the only democratic country in the world to get out of the Great Depression before World War II. Didn't wait for a war to do sensible things for the war effort. You did sensible things, common sense things in peacetime. I thank the Democratic Party for this opportunity to spread this message to the mayors and local and district councils, to Rotary clubs, and to public gatherings sponsored by the Democratic Party and by other organizations. I'll soon be going home, rather winded but happy, and then Bob Blaine, Sound of Wind and Limb, will take over the rubber chicken circuit and keep spreading the good word. Now, when I got off the plane, I had the idea that Canada was the only country in the world in which the Prime Minister had a lower public approval rating than the prime rate of interest. and that was July 30th, and that was the day your budget came down. And I saw right away that with Ruth Richardson's shoot 'em dead budget, that Jim Bolger was going to give Brian Mulrooney a run for his money in that dubious distinction of being the most unpopular prime minister. Now, the bad economic theories that brought these two once popular leaders down are disgustingly similar. They both broke their promises to the aged, and cut back on the old age pension. This was one of the first things the progressive conservative government of Canada did. They talked about the Canada's social programs as sacred trusts, and the first thing they did was to break this sacred trust. But they raised such a storm of protest, this granny bashing as we called it, that they were forced to back down. I commend our example to you, that you don't have to take that. Democratically elected governments, no matter how authoritarian they act once they're in, are subject to public pressure if you rouse people sufficiently. I commend you to go at it. The second reason for Brian Mulrooney's fall from grace was the GST. Now, we got that idea from you folks. Not so much the folks in the room, but thank you so much. All Canada is very grateful. I mean, what did we ever do to you anyway? The third reason Mulrooney slipped in the public opinion polls is that the free trade deal he negotiated with the United States did not deliver the goods the way it was advertised. It was supposed to create 200,000 new jobs. It was supposed to greatly increase our efficiency and increase the amount of investment in Canada. It hasn't had those effects. Of course, the U.S. is slipping into depression also, but with interest rates 4 percentage points higher in Canada than in the United States, and higher taxes, the flow of resources have been mostly out of Canada. Canadians live along the U.S. border. We're strung along 90% of the population with 100 miles of the U.S. border, and there's been a tremendous increase in cross-border shopping. Canadians filling up their cars with gasoline in the United States, filling up the back seat with the groceries and so on, and driving back in. So that hasn't worked very well either. I particularly want to thank the Democratic Party for inviting me to your beautiful country, my wife, at such an interesting time in your political history. This is fantastic what's happening. Glittering prospects open before you to achieve what we've all dreamed about, a breakthrough for monetary reform. Not just to hold the balance of power, which might have been the height of your ambitions perhaps a few months ago, and force the National or the Labour Party to bid for your support for the right to form the government, not just the hope of becoming the official opposition someday, but if this alliance that you're all working on and all hoping for really gels, and as it should, as it must, why you're going to be in the next government of New Zealand, and all kinds of wonderful things can happen. As a visitor, as an outsider, of course, I have no wish to take sides in your internal politics as you select your leaders and your platform. But as an outsider who wishes you well, has been made to feel almost like one of the family, I do want to offer you some well-intended advice. It is my belief that the cause of monetary reform, the cause of social credit, has been held back by a tendency of some social credit enthusiasts, perhaps nobody in this room, to scorn all economists and other financial types as idiots and enemies, unless, of course, they agree with you in every detail and with Major Douglas in every particular. Now, I don't deny that some economists, perhaps a majority of economists, deserve such treatment. But you have more allies than you know of. We'll need more before we'll be able to convert the world to meaningful reform of our present unstable, unsustainable, unjust, even insane financial system. Now, it's pretty easy to demonstrate that even the greatest of economic thinkers have made mistakes, that their theories at times are not borne out when tested by facts. But the greatest economists are so regarded because they were seen to be right so much of the time. Thus they gained followers. Schools of thought were built on the foundations laid by a mere handful of thinkers: Smithian or classical economics, Marxian economics, Keynesian economics, Friedmanian or monetarist economics. And it almost goes without saying that the followers of these few greats are poorer economists than the greats themselves. I mean, it's almost a definitional thing. That's why they're followers. And they have simplified, they've codified, they've even bastardized the ideas of the original great thinkers. So that the public often thinks of Smithian economics or Keynesian economics in tremendously oversimplified terms. That reduce it all to a short slogan. Adam Smith taught that the market could do no wrong and the government could do no right. Or that Marx thought that all capitalists should be hunted down and shot. Or that Keynes thought that governments could borrow and spend their way out of any economic difficulty whatsoever. Or that Friedman wants to cause enough unemployment to make inflation stop. He cares about nothing else. Now, every one of those statements is such an oversimplification and a distortion as to be almost complete distortion of the, quote, great man's thought. Furthermore, every one of these greats is an ally to the cause of monetary reform, at least on certain pages of what they wrote. You have to be selective. Okay, so Adam Smith. Adam Smith made many exceptions to his general rule of let the market decide. Among the most important for our purposes are his support for usury laws to keep down the rate of interest and his contempt for the special interest pleading of businessmen and bankers to the effect that what's good for us is good for the country. Now, Marx, quite rightly, probably has few if any admirers in the room, but he was very far from wholly wrong. Could anything be a better stated indictment of the quaint and curious custom of a government borrowing money from banks instead of creating the money itself than this statement of Marx's, which I'll now quote. This is from Das Kapital. Is there anything more crazy than that between 1797 and 1817, for example, the Bank of England, which was a private bank until 1947, maybe they reprivatized it again, sillies. That was me, not Marx, whose notes only had credit thanks to the state, then got, that is by the public, in the form of interest on government loans, for the power the state gave to it to transform these very notes from paper into money and then lend it to the state. Now, if it wasn't Marx that said that, we'd probably print that up somewhere. But he's in bad order. Okay. Now, this would be far too long a lecture if I tried to show you all the many ways in which John Maynard Keynes is an ally to us in monetary reform. But I'll mention just a few things. He wanted to get interest rates down to zero and make it impossible for people to just to sit on their assets and collect income. He talked about this, the euthanasia or mercy killing of the rentier, that you had to go out and enterprise with your money, use it in ways of risk it, hope of a profit to gain large incomes at all. He certainly is our ally in looking to full employment, using the government's fiscal and monetary and other policies to get the economy to full employment when it doesn't get there by itself. Marx failed to convince the world that capitalism doesn't run at full employment. Keynes, at least for 30 years there, convinced the world that we could run the economy at full employment if we'd only modify the system to get us there. And that's what we want too. Now, he also fought a good fight, and shortened his life, to create the Bretton Woods twins of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in much better shape than what we actually got. Keynes fought hard for an International Monetary Fund which could discipline surplus countries and force them to expand. Instead, we got an International Monetary Fund which is only capable of hammering on the heads of those countries who have deficits in their balance of payments, who are in debt to the rest of the world. He pointed out this would be a disaster, and he was absolutely right. Okay, but which of these famous four is the one who is our closest ally if we really got to know him? Now, I want to spend a few minutes telling you something that may surprise you, that the economist that probably has the least good image in this room is also the one who, properly used, selectively used, is the best ally, and that's Milton Friedman. The very man, yes, I know, the very man who is known as the father of monetarism, of new rightism, of hammering economies down to zero inflation by almost zero output and employment, was a disciple, was a student of the old Chicago school of the 1930s, who saw clearly, as clearly as anybody saw, that it was the banking system that had collapsed, and it was the banking system that had to be fixed. And what they advocated was what they called 100% money, that the government take back from the private sector all money power, money creation power, and then use it through its treasury or central bank or a new currency commission to expand the money supply constantly at the full employment potential of the economy. This was the program of Henry C. Simons, Friedman's teacher, and Lloyd Mintz, and Lachlan Curry, and Paul Douglas, and the most famous American economist of the 1930s and 20s, Irving Fisher. These men had very high hopes of making a long-run solution to depression rather than the mere short-run solution which John Maynard Keynes and Hitler really put over on the world. That instead of the government borrowing the money for recovery, they would create it themselves, governments would create it themselves, and the world would work much better. And in his youth, Milton Friedman pushed this very hard with very excellent articles that you should disinter. Read the one in the American Economic Review in 1948. The exact title is, hold it just a second, I've said it so many times right now, I want to make sure I've got it right. A Monetary and Fiscal Framework for Economic Stability. Now, I don't agree with everything that Milton Friedman says, not by a long shot, but when some self-important economist tells you, you're a bunch of amateurs, you don't understand the great monetary theorists, you say, no, I'm a disciple of Milton Friedman. I want what he wants, 100% government-created money. And they say, well, you're crazy, and you show it. No, I'm talking about his views and the views of the Chicago school of what has to be done. Now, it's true that Milton Friedman doesn't talk about that much anymore, and I wrote to him a few years ago to ask him, why not? Have you changed your mind? If so, where did you say so and why? And he said, no. He wrote back to me and said, no, I didn't change my mind, but I couldn't convince the world. I got tired of tilting at windmills. At the time I wrote those articles, the governments were creating half the money for the war. And I saw that we could go to 100% government money. And the world went the other way. It went to 50%, 40, and 30, and 10, and 5. And I got tired of tilting at windmills. Don Quixote image there, of course. He stopped dreaming the then impossible dream. But maybe I'm still tilting at the windmill that Mr. Friedman gave up on. Because I love that song, don't you? Dream of the impossible dream, fight the unbeatable foe. Okay, now another way in which Friedman is also an ally is his searing criticism of defective institutions and the corrupted bureaucrats who run our central banks. Not for the greatest good of society or even for the good of the duly elected government, but for the special interests of the private bankers and financiers. Thus he wrote in a recent article on the U.S. Federal Reserve System, quote, "If the present monetary structure were producing satisfactory results, we would then be well advised to leave it alone. Tactics would then be the only topic. However, the present monetary structure is not producing satisfactory results. Indeed, in my opinion, no major institution in the United States has such a poor record of performance over such a long period, yet so high a public reputation as the Federal Reserve." This is in an article, The Case for Overhauling the Federal Reserve in Challenge for July-August 1985. Now, Friedman maintains that the trouble with government regulatory agencies is that they become captives of the very industry they were set up to control, and that the end result is often worse than if the government had let the industry alone in the first place. This is because the regulated industry, through the corrupted control agency, can use public power against the public interest. He maintains that this generalization applies in spades to the world's central bankers, who now serve the private bankers, not the public interest. However, the economist who has put this principle most colorfully is not Friedman, but Jan Kragle. Jan asks us to think of the Coca-Cola Corporation. Here's a fabulously successful purveyor of the most popular soft drink in the world. It's got a secret formula that makes its customers fiercely loyal. When they tried to change the formula, my wife Jenny got very hard to live with for a while there, until they went back to the original. And so they're doing very well in what they do. But picture another management taking over Coke and giving away the secret formula to Pepsi and all the other bottlers for nothing, and placing big ads in the paper saying Pepsi's better for you anyway, and buying the Pepsi back or borrowing back from Pepsi to bottle in their own bottles and paying interest to Pepsi and so on. Very quickly, the stockholders of Coca-Cola would rise up in their wrath at these idiots and knaves, fools and knaves who are ruining their company. And that's how angry, how determined to overthrow them we should be as citizens at the government officials and bureaucrats in the central banks who have done just that to us. The central bank is the low-cost, efficient producer of money that we've set up. It's been perverted, corrupted, to give up its business to its competitors, its high-cost, inefficient private banks. I think that's quite a way Jan has of putting that. Okay. But really, I haven't come here to lecture you any further about some of us economists are pretty good guys, despite all the contrary evidence that you could amass, other than to say that we need you as well as you need us. That's really what I want to say. Those economists in the 1930s who put the bills into Congress, and they had 120 co-sponsors in the U.S. Congress for a bill to change it, failed, I believe, ultimately because there was not a mass movement behind it. There was not a sufficient individual and political will based on a true understanding of money and credit to make it work then. Now, the worse the economy works, the better the hope is that we will be able to win this time where we didn't last time. So that's really what I want to talk to you about. And I don't have any more Coke jokes. Mr. Douglas, C.H. Douglas had some things. He wasn't infallible either. I don't want to get involved in where I think he showed that, but Mr. Douglas had something more important than infallibility. He had a vision, and he had passion. And he had a lot of knowledge too. I'm not saying that he wasn't right, very right. He had a vision of the iniquity and inefficiency of the present financial system, and a vision of a better world where money served human beings rather than human beings serving money. And he had passion to go from the imperfect system we have to one that would work, which would serve mankind. And that's what you have, or you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be carrying out this lonesome, long fight for sane monetary institutions and policies. But the question remains, how do you and I, who share these insights, this vision, and this passion for these ideas, make them real in a real world? How do we overcome the forces in the world, ignorance, greed, fear of the new, invested interest in the old, which keep the present system going? Now, Victor Hugo once said that all the forces in the world are not as powerful as an idea whose time has come. So then the question becomes, how do you make an idea's time come? Extremely important question. And the next question, is it even possible to make an idea's time come, or does it just happen? So that's what I want to spend the rest of my time with you on. I believe that and Margaret Mead wrote, never doubt that a small dedicated group can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. I believe that if we study movements whose ideas' time came, whose ideas changed the world, we can see what has to be done to achieve meaningful monetary reform. Now, an idea's time comes when it shifts, when it is transformed from a position or content to a context which holds all positions. I'll read that again. An idea's time comes when it shifts, when it is transformed from a position or content to a context which holds all positions. And what does that mean? Perhaps a few examples will help. The idea is we ought to end slavery, or it would be great to explore the moon, existed for a very long time as positions before they became transformed into ideas whose time had come. As long as they were positions, they generated research and controversy and new positions, but they didn't happen. Somebody says we ought to end slavery. Somebody else will say, no, slavery is God's will. You say, no, it's not God's will. God shows me in personal revelations that he wants slavery to end. Well, it's not economically feasible, et cetera, et cetera. All this discussion, all this business of trying to appeal to facts and reason, the very thing that professors, among others, do, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for an idea's time coming. These are just positions and counterpositions and so on. But when an idea is transformed by a sufficient individual and political, passionate will to achieve it, then its time comes. When the idea, end slavery, is transformed from just a good idea that sets up other ideas to enough people, a critical mass of people saying, we must end slavery, and the only question becomes how, by what means to do that, then its time has come. John F. Kennedy made a trip to the moon, and idea's time has come by a speech where he committed the United States to do that. We're going to put a man on the moon and bring him back in this decade. Then, within that context created by this is what we're going to do, you could deal with such questions in a meaningful way as should we use 2-stage rockets or 3? Should we use liquid fuel or solid? All the engineers then can do what they do in a context that we're going to do this. And you find out they don't have the right ceramics or something to do it, well, they go ahead and invent it or find a substitute and so on. But it's only after that is become a political agenda, if it's a big thing that involves the government in so many of the social changes, whether it's votes for all men, and then votes for first just for a few rich property owners, then for all males, and then for all men and women, and so on. All those things have to go through a process from advocacy to a political program to carry them out. And it's often a very long and difficult struggle before that happens, as all of you know. Let's look a little bit more at the slavery example. In the 19th century, somehow the British anti-slavery societies were able to take the position, end slavery, and turn it into an idea whose time has come. And historians and economic historians are still arguing about how they did that. They did it partly by rousing the conscience of mankind, and partly by appealing to enlightened self-interest. There have been slave revolts in Haiti where every white man died, and they didn't want that to happen in the British Sugar Islands. Now, the British government had not been, or the British people had not been particularly enlightened about slavery until the anti-slavery societies went to work. Far from it. The British Empire is more guilty for the African slave trade than any other nation. The horrors of the Middle Passage, where half the slaves died on the ships and their bodies were dumped overseas. Those were British ships. And the horrors of plantation slavery were most severe in the British Empire. This is because at that time the Church of England taught that Africans are not people. They're a kind of ape. They have no souls to save or any rights that you have to respect. And yet it was out of that unpromising material that in a few generations of agitation and propaganda and chaining themselves to the doors of Parliament and so on, a mere handful, probably far less than 1% of the British population, and then eventually perhaps it's a critical mass of 1% of the people who really know what they want, they were able to get the British government converted to end slavery peacefully, without bloodshed, buying the slaves and setting them free. Now, when they did that, as I say, the idea end slavery's time came. And when an idea's time comes, it takes whatever opening is available to it. And in the United States, because of the peculiarities of its constitution and the extreme resistance of the Southern slaveholders to losing their property, the only opening for the end of slavery was the one it took, a bloody civil war after a 25-year struggle to find some other way to end the slavery. Okay, and as I say, especially in the early days of that struggle, the abolitionists were not popular people. They were scorned and hated by those who felt threatened by them. Now, one of the abolitionists was a young, well-born Bostonian named James Russell Lowell, who in 1845 put his credo into a poem. This poem was later set to music, and I sometimes sang it in church as a boy. Susan George, a development economist who maintains that the IMF should be abolished, by the way, recently reminded me of this poem, and I'd like to read it to you. I don't know whether it reached New Zealand, but it speaks to us now, to those of us who would abolish the debt money system, debt slavery, as it did to his day's desire to abolish the evils of slavery, a desire which is not fulfilled in the U.S. for another 20 years. See if you recognize this poem. Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide. In the strife of truth with falsehood, for the good or evil side, some great cause, God's new Messiah, offering each bloom or blight, and the choice goes on forever twixt that darkness and that light. But is monetary reform really a holy cause, a great moral or even religious cause like ending slavery? Yes, I believe it is. UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, has shown in the last few issues of the State of the World's Children report that 500,000 children die every 12 months in the third world because we have not resolved the debt crisis, which is crippling their economies. It shows that large areas of Latin America and Africa are more poverty-stricken now than they were in 1970. It shows that it's because of the First World taking out more in debt repayments than it is putting in new resources. Now, throughout the 1980s, they've been stuck in a second Great Depression. But in 1990, another great ideas time came. It happened at the World Summit for Children almost 11 months ago, almost exactly 11 months ago, in September 29th and 30th of 1990. 71 world leaders, the largest assembly of world leaders the world has ever seen, got together and pledged themselves to eradicate the worst aspects of hunger and poverty on this planet and save 50 million young lives during the decade of the 1990s. Now that is the culmination of exactly the same kind of struggle, which is the civil rights struggle or the women's liberation struggles or the end slavery struggles. There were organizations, I was proud to be part of one of them, called the Hunger Project, that made that the agenda. We did it by enrolling 6 million people in every country on the planet. Hundreds of thousands and millions of people committed themselves to achieving exactly that, of creating the idea the end of hunger and starvation by the end of the century is an idea whose time has come, and creating the political will to make that happen. So when the 71 world leaders say that's what we're going to do, and 160 nations and all ratify that's what we're going to do, the idea's time has come. The rest of it is just the doing of it. And I submit that as the world leaders struggle in the developing countries and the developed countries to fulfill that promise, and in some shape or other, I do believe they will see that in order to achieve what they promised to do, and in order to achieve the things that the Greens rightly want to happen, urgently have to have happen with the ozone layer and global warming, as we put our minds to the things we've got to do and the things we want to do, we will see that we need monetary reform as part of the package, as a necessary, though still not sufficient condition to ending world hunger and poverty and dealing with our environmental crisis. We will have to, they will have to reform the International Monetary Fund, or abolish it like Susan George wants, and start with a clean piece of paper, because it is about as corrupted an institution as the KGB in the Soviet Union, and with its lethal effects on the world. You take 500,000 children extra dying for 10 years, you've got the kind of numbers that you talk about. It's the minimum estimate of what the KGB did, or Hitler's Holocaust. So we've got evil. We've got evil in the world. It's not be ashamed to use the old-fashioned and religious terms about this. And so we face great difficulties, but we have more allies, more people around the world who realize this than we perhaps have thought in the past. Okay, so when you demand fundamental change in the way the world is organized, even fundamental reform so that all the world's children can eat, you can expect to arouse much opposition. Lowell had his share. Let's return to his poem. Second verse. Then to side with truth is noble, when we share her wretched crust. Ere her cause bring fame and profit, and 'tis prosperous to be just. Then it is the brave man who chooses, while the coward stands aside, till the multitude make virtue of the faith they had denied. Making our ideas time come is a tall order. We face real and powerful enemies. There will be setbacks and discouragements and even failures. But there are more and more of us throughout the world who see the evils of the current system and who are struggling in different circumstances and in different ways for the same goals. So let me end with Lowell's last stanza, where he speaks of these trials and how we, having chosen to make history, do finally come to make history. Though the cause of evil prosper, yet 'tis truth alone 'tis strong. Though her portion be the scaffold, and upon the throne be wrong, yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. We shall overcome. Thank you.